Imagine looking at a national budget and uh, literally having to make a mathematical choice between funding a peace treaty or keeping the lights on.
Right. It sounds completely absurd.
It sounds like a total exaggeration, yeah. But that is the exact, impossible math facing Colombian voters in this scenario.
It really is.
So we are standing at this hypothetical but deeply data-driven crossroads. It's May 2026. The ballots are being cast, and Colombia is looking toward 2030.
And the map we have in front of us, which is built from a really massive stack of current data and political trajectories, it doesn't just show different policy routes.
No, not at all.
It's just completely different national realities. It's a profound structural juncture.
Yeah, and the sources we're diving into today, they dictate not just the immediate economic metrics, but the actual social fabric of the nation for, the next generation.
Exactly. We're looking at candidate platforms, historical economic data from DANE, which is Colombia's National Administrative Department of Statistics Defense Ministry, security reports, and all these academic studies on peace and growth.
It's a lot to unpack. But before we start breaking down those numbers, we really need to establish the ground rules for you, our listener.
Yes, very important.
The sources we are diving into contain some highly politically charged material. We are looking at perspectives that span from the progressive left all the way to the hardline right.
Right, the full spectrum.
So I want to be unequivocally clear here.
Yeah.
Neither of us is taking a side. We are not endorsing any candidate, and we are certainly not validating any specific ideology.
No, not at all. Our mission in this deep dive is strictly analytical.
Exactly. We are just here to impartially report on the ideas, the specific goals, and most importantly, the hidden trade-offs contained in the original source material.
And that concept of trade-offs is, it's the engine driving this entire analysis.
Oh, for sure.
Every single policy platform has a price tag. And that price isn't always financial, By looking at three specific figures in this 2026 scenario, Iván Cepeda, Abelardo de la Espriella, and Paloma Valencia, you will see how prioritizing one area inherently creates profound vulnerabilities in another.
Whether that's security, the economy, or social welfare.
Exactly. You just cannot maximize everything simultaneously.
So let's test that theory by looking at the first trade-off, which is basically trading current economic engines for long-term social equity.
Right.
The sources describe this path as transformative continuity. And the figure right at the center of it is Iván Cepeda.
Now, for those who might just know his name from the headlines, his background is highly specific.
Yeah, he's a philosopher, a human rights defender, a senator, and the son of Manuel Cepeda Vargas.
Crucially, though, he has spent years as a key facilitator for peace processes with armed groups like the FARC and the ELN.
Which is huge. And his background completely dictates his entire strategy here.
It really does. Cepeda's primary objective is what the sources call consolidating total peace and transitional justice.
Right, so the goal is structural societal shifts.
Yeah.
Rather than just, militarized security.
Exactly. And there's specific data in the sources supporting the mechanism of this approach. INDEPAZ, the Institute for Development and Peace Studies, they track these metrics incredibly closely.
And what do they say?
Well, their data indicates that historical peace processes, when they prioritize social prevention and dialogue over pure military force, they actually do lead to initial measurable reductions in violence as demobilizations advance.
Okay, but I can hear our listeners rolling their eyes a bit right now.
Oh, I'm sure.
Thinking, sure, violence drops on paper while the cartels just quietly consolidate power in the background.
Right, the classic critique.
Yeah. Does the INDEPAZ data actually account for the difference between a real peace process and just like a temporary mafia truce?
Well, it does.
Because treating systemic violence with dialogue feels a bit like, trying to rebuild a house's foundation while you are still living inside it.
That's a good way to put it.
It's incredibly messy.
Right.
And it leaves you totally exposed to the elements for a long time.
Yeah, and the data absolutely reflects that fragility. INDEPAZ and other monitors show that homicides might drop initially.
Okay.
But power vacuums are immediately created when a major armed group steps down.
Oh, right, because someone else just moves in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the state doesn't instantly fill that vacuum with infrastructure, legal economies, and security, a new illicit group just takes over.
Wow.
That is exactly why Cepeda's platform demands a massive, immediate expansion of the state's role in health, education, and housing.
Which brings us to the math.
And I have to say, the math in these sources is daunting.
Very.
Cepede's stated goal is to drop the poverty rate from its current level of roughly 36% down to somewhere around 25 or 30%.
Which is a massive jump.
Huge. And he also wants to significantly reduce the Gini coefficient.
Right, which for anyone unfamiliar is just the standard mathematical measure of wealth inequality.
Right, so essentially shrinking that massive gap between Colombia's ultra-rich and ultra-poor.
Yes. And he plans to do this by creating green jobs through agroecology and renewable energy. But here's the catch: oil and mining currently make up 20 to 25% of Colombia's exports.
Yeah, that's the sticking point.
So how does the math actually work if you are squeezing your primary export industry to fund literally the most massive social spending program in modern history?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the short answer is the math relies on a razor-thin margin of error.
Just razor thin.
Barely there. The sources suggest that a moderate economic growth of, say, 3 to 4% annually is technically possible under this scenario.
Okay.
But that assumes perfect macroeconomic stability. You're trying to pivot an entire national economy away from extraction while simultaneously writing these massive checks for agrarian reform.
Right. So the tension between the government and the private extractive sector becomes severe.
Very severe.
Because capital is notoriously skittish. If foreign investors see the government being openly hostile to the industries that historically generate the highest returns, they don't just stick around to see how the Green Jobs Initiative plays out.
No, they pull their money.
They pull it immediately.
They do, and that creates a catastrophic domino effect for the peace process itself.
Really? How so?
Well, the sources point to extensive academic studies from the Universidad de los Andes, and these studies prove that the sustainability of peace relies heavily on tangible economic results.
Oh, I see.
So if private investment flight occurs, the state suddenly faces immense fiscal pressure.
The government goes broke.
Exactly. A broke government cannot fund the social programs meant to replace the illicit economies.
Right.
And it cannot maintain the security apparatus needed to hold the territories abandoned by those demobilized groups.
So the holistic healing fails completely because the patient essentially starves to death during the transition.
Unfortunately, yes.
Wow. Okay. So let's follow the causal chain of that exact failure. Let's say we are in a scenario where capital is vanishing, the transition to green energy is stalling, and homicide rates are ticking back up because the state couldn't fill those power vacuums.
Right. A worst-case scenario.
Exactly. When a society feels that kind of multifaceted fear, voters historically do not ask for more patience and slow healing, do they?
No, they certainly do not. They vote for immediate, forceful order.
Which creates the exact environment for a radical shift in the opposite direction. Just a total shock to the system born out of absolute frustration with insecurity and economic stagnation.
Enter our second figure.
Yes, Abelardo de la Espriella, widely known as El Tigre.
The tiger.
Right. So, he is a criminal lawyer, a very wealthy businessman, and an unapologetic right-wing outsider leading the Defensores de la Patria movement.
And his entire platform is constructed as the ultimate antithesis to the radical left.
Completely. The sources outline his core economic concept as Patria Milagro, the miracle homeland.
Which is an ambitious name.
Very. He is aiming for over 5% annual GDP growth. And this is driven by a massive wave of deregulation, tax simplification, and opening the floodgates for foreign investment.
Specifically in traditional energy, agribusiness, and mega infrastructure.
Right. He essentially views the state as an underperforming asset that needs to be stripped of all its red tape and optimized for immediate capital generation.
It sounds like a ruthless corporate turnaround.
Okay, let's unpack this corporate turnaround analogy, because you know the scenario, right?
Yeah.
A company is bleeding money, a new CEO comes in, slashes all the environmental and labor regulations.
Cuts the unprofitable departments.
Exactly, and drives relentlessly for quarterly profits.
And the stock price shoots up. You get fast results.
You do. But the problem is, you can fire an unprofitable department in a company.
Right.
You cannot fire marginalized communities in a country.
No, you cannot.
So how does his iron fist, this mano dura security policy, actually translate to the streets?
Well, the corporate turnaround analogy captures the economic ambition perfectly. But you are absolutely right. It completely breaks down when applied to human beings.
So what's the mechanism?
To understand the security mechanism here, the sources explicitly draw a comparison to recent policies in El Salvador.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Mano dura requires a heavy, undeniable military and police presence in every single territory.
Combined with, what, vastly harsher penalties.
Yes. and the aggressive, forced eradication of illicit crops.
And the data from El Salvador suggests that kind of overwhelming force actually works, doesn't it? At least in the short term.
Well, the metrics undeniably change. When you lock up tens of thousands of people and put the military on literally every corner, the data shows rapid, dramatic drops in street violence, homicides, and extortion.
The bleeding stops.
The bleeding stops. And business confidence returns, which is what fuels that miracle 5% economic growth.
Right.
But the historical data also reveals the hidden, devastating costs of that approach.
The human rights cost.
Yes. The sources note that to execute a highly repressive security policy without just descending into a dictatorship, a state requires incredibly strong institutional counterweights.
Like what?
You need fiercely independent courts, robust oversight committees, and a completely free press to ensure the military and police aren't just disappearing innocent people.
Right. And if an outsider candidate fundamentally distrusts those institutions,
Then the iron fist becomes tyranny very, very quickly.
and there's a massive economic vulnerability here too, isn't there?
Definitely.
I mean, if you deregulate everything and trigger a boom in foreign investment, but you have zero targeted social inclusion, the wealth just concentrates at the absolute top.
The rich get much richer very quickly, while the rural and urban poor are completely left behind by the boom.
Which is terrifying.
It is. Historical data points to a very clear pattern here.
Yeah.
When you combine severe widening inequality with a highly repressive security apparatus, you are essentially building a pressure cooker with no release valve. The probability of a severe rebound in social conflict skyrockets. Eventually, the pressure builds up under the surface until it explodes.
Into mass protests or a resurgence of armed insurgency.
Exactly. Furthermore, as an anti-establishment outsider, he would face near impossible challenges building the coalitions in Congress needed to even pass these sweeping deregulations.
Right. So the shock to the system might just break the system entirely.
Very possible.
So looking at this map, the voter is kind of trapped.
They really are.
The left path risks crashing the national wallet and causing capital flight. The outsider right path risks human rights abuses and an eventual social explosion.
Right.
So if you are terrified of both the economic cliffs and the societal pressure cooker, where is the safe harbor?
Well, you look for the institutional middle.
Okay.
You look for a pragmatic attempt to thread the needle.
Which brings us to the third scenario represented by Paloma Valencia.
Exactly.
So she is a senator, an economist trained at the Universidad de los Andes, and notably the first strong female candidate for the Centro Democrático.
And she represents a fierce loyalty to the Uribista legacy.
Right. The sources define her platform as democratic security combined with strict fiscal austerity.
It is a very deliberate return to the doctrine of the early 2000s Uribe era.
And what does that mechanism actually involve?
It involves intense, highly structured military and police pressure. But importantly, it aims to combine that with regional economic development rather than just pure unchecked force.
And does the data support that?
Well, the source material cites evidence from those Uribe periods showing significant measurable drops in homicides and kidnappings.
Okay. Economically, she is targeting a middle ground of 4 to 5% GDP growth, right?
Right.
By controlling public spending and making the markets highly predictable for investors.
Yes, exactly.
But the policy mechanism that really stands out in the sources is her stance on energy.
This is fascinating.
It is. She wants to keep the traditional hydrocarbon industry running at full capacity, but utilize strictly regulated fracking specifically to fund the transition to renewable energy. It's almost like using the profits from selling your old, massive, gas-guzzling truck to finance the down payment on a brand new Tesla.
That's a great analogy.
Right. She wants to squeeze the last drop of value out of a controversial industry just to buy the country's way into the green economy.
It is the ultimate pragmatic compromise. You don't kill the oil and gas industry that sustains the national budget.
Yeah.
But you legally earmark those specific fracking revenues to build the green infrastructure of the future.
Which sounds incredibly reasonable in a white paper.
It does.
But let me challenge the reality of this middle path.
Go for it.
If you're constantly applying austerity over here to please the markets and deploying the military over there to project strength, aren't you just inheriting everyone's anger?
You really are.
I mean, the left hates the fracking and the security posture. The hard right thinks you aren't going far enough. And the rural poor are still starving because austerity means social programs get cut.
You have identified the exact structural flaw of institutional pragmatism right there.
Really?
Yes.
The sources emphasize that this path inherits a massive pre-existing polarization.
Ah.
When a government doesn't offer a radical, sweeping vision to a desperate populace, managing their incredibly high expectations is just nearly impossible.
That makes total sense.
But the deeper failure is economic, and it shows up clearly in the regional data.
The sources cite data from ESALAS and the World Bank here, right?
Yes. ESALAS is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and their data tracks structural development and inequality over time.
And what did their numbers reveal?
Glaring, persistent gaps in Colombia's regional periphery.
Oh, wow.
Wealth, security, and infrastructure naturally concentrate in the urban centers like Bogotá or Medellin.
Okay, but how does austerity structurally impact that? Why does a balanced budget fail the rural areas so badly?
Well, because when you mandate fiscal discipline and cut federal budgets, the very first things to get slashed are infrastructure projects in remote, conflict-affected areas.
Oh, because they're expensive.
Exactly. Building a road through a mountain pass in the periphery is exponentially more expensive and yields far fewer votes than, say, subsidizing transit in the capital.
Right. So the middle path keeps the stock market completely stable, but it effectively starves the rural areas of the capital they actually need to modernize.
Exactly. So the inequity just calcifies.
That's depressing.
Furthermore, a strict traditionalist approach relies heavily on historical playbooks.
Which means what exactly?
The sources suggest this makes it incredibly rigid when dealing with rapid, unprecedented generational transitions.
Oh, I see.
We are talking about the structural economic impacts of climate change on agriculture, or managing the displacement of workers by artificial intelligence.
Right, and integrating millions of migrants.
Exactly. Traditional austerity and police surges just do not solve complex 21st century technological and climate shifts.
So what does this all mean? We have dissected 3 incredibly vivid scenarios.
Oh.
But when we zoom out from the individual candidates and their specific platforms, what are the underlying macro forces that will actually dictate Colombia's future, regardless of who is sitting in the Casa de Nariño, the presidential palace?
The ultimate synthesis of this data is that the presidency is far weaker than campaign rhetoric suggests.
Really? Even with all that power?
Yes. Success for any of these candidates relies on massive variables completely outside their immediate control.
Like what?
Well, first and foremost is execution capacity.
Okay.
It is one thing to pass a sweeping agrarian reform or a massive security mobilization on paper.
Right.
It is entirely another to force a slow, often corrupt bureaucracy to actually administer those programs across thousands of miles of difficult terrain.
Oh, yeah. And they can't even get to the bureaucracy without Congress.
Precisely.
Okay.
Without a working, stable coalition in Congress, every one of these radical or pragmatic visions simply dies on the Senate floor.
Wow. Then there are the international currents, I imagine.
Exactly. The global price of commodities, specifically oil and coal, will completely dictate the national budget.
So if oil crashes, Cepede's social programs die, El Tigre's economic miracle vanishes, and Valencia's fracking transition just goes bankrupt.
You nailed it. And add to that the ongoing dynamic integration of Venezuelan migrants, which requires adaptive economic policies that a rigid ideology simply can't handle.
Right.
But despite all those variables, the historical blueprint provided by the World Bank and Diane data offers a very clear objective truth about what actually works.
The 3 pillars.
The 3 pillars. The data proves over decades that genuine, sustainable progress in Colombia only occurs when a government successfully engineers 3 elements simultaneously.
And those are?
You need robust security to protect life and property, otherwise investment flees.
Right.
You need smart, targeted social investment to lift communities out of poverty, otherwise inequality breeds violence.
Makes sense.
And you need inclusive, dynamic economic growth to generate the actual wealth that pays for the security and the social programs.
Right. So if you sacrifice any one of those pillars to temporarily prop up the other 2, the entire national structure eventually collapses under its own weight.
The historical data is completely unforgiving on that point.
Wow. So as we look at this 2026 map, the voter is truly trapped in a triangle of risks.
They are.
Scenario 1, Avance Cepede prioritizes deep social equity and a holistic negotiated peace, but runs the severe risk of crippling the export economy, sparking capital flight, and bankrupting the state.
Right.
Scenario 2, Abelardo de la Espriella prioritizes absolute territorial order and aggressive economic dynamism, but risks severe societal fracture, widening inequality, and human rights abuses by removing institutional guardrails.
Exactly.
In scenario 3, Paloma Valencia prioritizes a pragmatic balance of traditional security and fiscal austerity, but risks alienating a highly polarized public and structurally abandoning the rural periphery to systemic poverty.
3 distinct philosophies, leading to 3 completely different sets of national consequences.
It is a heavy reality to process. But before we close this file, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Something that builds on all this evidence, but wasn't explicitly spelled out in the platforms.
Okay.
If the historical data from the World Bank and DAID definitively, mathematically shows that a country requires both robust capital investment and deep social equity to maintain a lasting peace. Wait, let me rephrase that.
Go ahead.
If the data shows you absolutely need both to survive,
Yeah.
why do our political systems continually force voters to choose between one or the other?
That is the million-dollar question.
Why is the ballot box always presented as a zero-sum choice between protecting the economy and protecting the marginalized?
Right.
Is it possible that the pendulum swing of modern politics, whiplashing from the systemic overhauls of the left to the hardline corporate order of the right every 4 to 8 years, is actually the single biggest threat to long-term national stability?
It's a terrifying thought.
Because if you are constantly tearing up the tracks to build a new train line, you never actually leave the station.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Colombia's 2026 crossroads. Keep questioning the data, keep demanding to know how the math works, and always remember to look at the bigger picture. We'll catch you next time.